Kia ora, team. Good evening. Good evening to you. Hope you're well. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a good night. I was having a very interesting night up until about 4 minutes ago. And about 4 minutes ago, I realized that there was the show that I was supposed to be doing and that I'd set up to do and had it all good to go and all ready and all these sorts of stuff. And then I had a look at the computer and it said, your broadcast is due to start in 24 hours. So honest answer is, and I'm a little bit sixes and sevens here, is I have a couple of pre-recorded interviews, which are really interesting interviews tonight, actually. And I'd set up to pre-record them. And guess what? I asked up the starting time. So at literally 1 minute to 10, I went, I wonder why I haven't got a notification of that show about to start. I had to look at it on my computer, and then it went due to start in 24 hours. So I'd set it up to play tomorrow night. So it took me 6 minutes to go from upstairs in the lounge watching Moon Knight to coming downstairs, turning on all the lights, turning on the computer, getting ready to go, and say hello to you. Hello, how are you? So what it means two things, right? The first thing is I've still got the main content to play for you, but I'll be here while we play it, which actually means previously I wouldn't have been in the studio. You would have just got the content and I wouldn't have been able to do this. Hey, Polita Kiwi. So what it means is you can actually participate in tonight's show. I'm going to have to be here. Not that that's a bad thing. I've got no complaints. I'm going to be here taking your comments. But tonight's show is going to have a couple of main conversations. And literally, I'm still setting up the audio and the video for those conversations because, as I said, I walked into the studio at 1 minute to 10. But the first one is, in fact, that's all in my, oh yeah, that's two. Excellent. Yes, I'm just opening up the actual stories that we're talking about. The first one is there is a economics lecturer at University of Canterbury. So this is me remembering everything. I normally have notes, but I have to remember them because I've only come to the studio 6 minutes ago. His name is Stephen Hickson. He wrote a piece about the inflation is the boogeyman this year. And inflation is the boogeyman in 2022. And I thought it was a really interesting piece that he wrote. And I wanted to talk to him about it because within the story, the inflation story that he wrote, it does a really good job of explaining what is inflation and what are the pressures of inflation and how is inflation being caused. And as I was preparing to talk to Stephen this afternoon, the ACT Party released, I don't know if you call it a manifesto, but it's like 9 steps of what would be their solutions to inflation. So it's a really interesting conversation with Stephen Hickson from University of Canterbury, from the School of Business. And what I'll do, I'm going to play that now, and you'll get to hear it, and you'll get to hear what he says is the cause of inflation, and what he says are the ways that it gets fixed. Whilst that's going on, I will go and re-find. There's a couple of other stories I wanted to talk about, not more minor stories, but just for a couple of minutes each on COVID. One is on, some schools now mandating masks, and then also what's happening to schools last term in New Zealand who did mandate masks because they got a much better result with their attendance. And also a story about how, I'm almost kind of telling you the story so I don't need to now, an academic on the conversation talking about research is showing now that the more times you get COVID, the higher the risk of getting long COVID. Now, I don't know whether that means if there's a 5% chance of getting long COVID, obviously if you get COVID 10 times, then you've got 10 5% chances, or whether it means like the first time and look, I'm saying 5%. I don't know if that's the number, but you get what I'm saying. if when you get COVID for the first time, you have a 5% chance of getting it, or when you get COVID the second time, it's a 7% chance, and then when you get it the third time, it's a 10% chance. But the article is written to say that the more times you get COVID, the more chance there is of getting long COVID. And within the article, and I'll show it to you between these two interviews, there's a really scary stat that says 30% of people who get COVID can be affected by some kind of long COVID. Now, the number that we have seen before is 10%. So I'm not sure whether this is a new number or whether this is an extension on the old number. But either way, to think about 1 in 3 people potentially having some effect of long COVID, if you think that like every New Zealander was to get it, which some people are saying, I don't quite buy into that. But if that was the case, that's like 1.7 million New Zealanders with some form of long COVID, which is 1.7 million New Zealanders with any kind of medical condition is terrifying, let alone long COVID, or some version of it. So, okay, and then the other thing we're going to do, it's a really fun conversation. I've already recorded it. It's with an academic out of, where is she? Oh, she's at Auckland University of Technology. Her name is Angelique Nairn, and she has written an article about female representation in the superhero narrative. The article is called "For the Love of Thor: Why is it so hard for Marvel to get its female superheroes right?" And it's a really interesting conversation around the superhero genre. It's a really interesting conversation around representation. It's not just, we don't just stick in the area of Marvel and that universe as well, but we go into like representation in other areas of arts and media. And that'll be coming up in the second half of the hour as well. So I'll leave you with the first conversation. And the first conversation is with Stephen Hickson. And we're talking about the ideas around inflation, what it all means, and what are the solutions to it. Have a listen, and I'll be back with you shortly. If you want to share your comments, feel free to add them to the comments on whatever platform you're watching on. And if it goes in, if I get a chance, I'll share some stuff during the interview. And if not, I'll play them at the end of it if people have got any comments about this inflation conversation or anything more. So here we go. Stephen Hickson for you from the University of Canterbury. Welcome to the show, Stephen Hickson. Stephen Hickson is a lecturer of economics at the University of Canterbury Business School. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Your article that you wrote in the last few days must be doing well, because inflation seems to be the hot button topic at the moment, and what most people think inflation and cost of living are going to lead us into the next election. That must be getting a good response from people at the moment. Good meaning lots of response from people at the moment.
Well, lots of interest, because I think that people are trying to understand what is inflation and how does it affect their life, because we have a generation who have grown up in an environment where inflation has been low.
Yeah.
And low inflation people can deal with, they can adjust, they can figure out how to actually cope with that. But 7, 8, 9, 10%, that's a different game. And it's a whole generation who have not experienced that. And this is new.
Actually, the truth is, not to disagree with you, we actually have 4 generations, because I'm Gen X. So I was a child in the 80s. So whilst technically it was there, it didn't affect me.
And you wouldn't remember it.
No, correct. Or it didn't affect my spending. I mean, 1 cent lollies were still 1 cent lollies. Then you got Gen Y, millennials. Then you got the Zoomers. And now if you're under, I think, 25, you're the next group, or under 10. No, 10 to 25 are Zoomers. And if you're under 10, that's actually the 4th generation. So technically I know we use the phrase, it's a generational thing, but it's like there's actually a lot of people, that's probably half of the population, if not more, who haven't really been affected by inflation before.
And look, I would agree with that. I mean, I think I used the phrase, there's a whole generation, to really kind of mean people whose living memory doesn't go back prior to around about 1990. Are not going to remember what inflation was really like and how it actually mattered to people's lives.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. Now, your article that I have up on the screen here, Stephen Hickson, inflation is 2022's boogeyman. How can we address rising costs of living while helping bringing it down? Now, you spend a bit of time in your article talking about inflation, but rather than me reading out your article to you while you sit there, explain to us inflation.
So inflation is just simply overall rising prices, and you'll see it if every week you go back to the supermarket, you are paying a little bit more for the same basket of goods and services. So that's what inflation is. It's the rising cost of the same basket of goods and services. Now, at that point, you might say, so what? Who cares, right? But a little bit of inflation is okay, but a lot is not. And inflation acts like rust. It eats away at the value of your money, and it does so just quietly working away, eroding the value of your money. So that hurts anyone who has to use or hold money. And of course, that's most of us. And the way that I often explain this to people is, so don't think about money in terms of its face value, right?
Yeah.
Think about what it can buy. Right. So if last year $100 bought you 20 cups of coffee, then they were $5 each. And if this year coffee's $6 each, well, you only get 16. And that means you've still got $100. The face value is the same, but it's buying you fewer cups of coffee. And that's the problem. What's on the front of the note doesn't matter. And that's going to hurt people like wage earners who don't get to renegotiate their salaries every day. And they might only get a wage adjustment yearly or twice yearly or something. Superannuitants, welfare beneficiaries, of course, they're on fixed incomes as well. They don't get adjusted every week or month. And so inflation just continues to eat away at that, slowly eroding what people can buy. And so then people have to try and catch that up. And that's when they start to negotiate for bigger pay increases, and that itself becomes inflationary. So that's one of the bad effects that we get from inflation. We also find that it distorts people's saving and borrowing decisions, because if you think back to, say, this generation's grandparents or great-grandparents, who back in the 70s might have paid, say, $30,000 for a house. And then because of high inflation, right, 6, 7, 8, 9 years later, the house is now worth $120,000, but the mortgage is still $30,000.
Yeah, right.
And so the mortgage, the debt, is a much lower fraction of the asset. And you might think, hey, isn't that a good thing? Well, no. What it does is it encourages people to borrow money when they ought not, and it harms savers. So the person who lent you that $30,000 used to be able to buy a house with that $30,000, and now they can't. So it advantages borrowers in a not very good way, and disadvantages savers. So we've forgotten some of those things. I think one of the reasons why by the end of the 80s, most developed countries had figured out that they had to get inflation under control was because of those sorts of distortions in the economy. And there's a risk, I think, that people who have not experienced those sorts of effects will not understand why we have to get inflation under control. I don't know what's so bad about it, really.
So what's the difference, in, if anything, between inflation and like price rises? Does it come down to sort of essentials that are going up? Like if you buy a car, let's say a brand new car was $30,000, and then next year that same model car for the new year was $40,000. Is that just like a price rise, or is it inflation? Are we saying that every time prices go up, that's technically inflation, or is there a difference?
So inflation, remember, is about the overall price level in the economy. So prices go up and down all the time. For the last 30 years, what we've experienced is rising prices for some things, but falling prices for others. Right. And if you think about electronics, for example, you pay a lot less now for your computer than you did 20, 30 years ago. You know, when I first bought my family a home computer back in the mid-90s, it cost me $3,000, right? Now, those things have gone down in price. Other things have gone up in price. Some things have stayed flat. But overall, for the last 20, 30 years, those have all balanced out. And people are able to adjust away. And so they're able to go, well, okay, bananas have gone up a lot in price, but apples haven't. So I'll buy fewer bananas and more apples. But the problem with inflation is all things are going up by and large. So consumers are facing not only rising prices for bananas, but also apples and everything else, right? And so they don't have that ability to reorganize their expenditure into things that are cheaper. So it's overall, it's not just one price rise that happens all the time. It's pretty much when everything you buy is at some level going up.
I would assume as well, we, the consumer, would therefore obviously feel inflation more when it's an essential as well. Like if it was that example of the car that I was talking about, you don't have to buy a car, but you do have to buy the bananas or the apples or the whatever it is. So there could be, I mean, is it possible that there's inflation sometimes that is kind of neither here nor there because we don't have to have it, but when it becomes to things like power, if it was power, or food or housing, then we can't not avoid it. So it becomes more of a societal issue.
And actually, inflation hurts different people differently. So we talk about inflation as if it's one number. And the reason why it's one number is because what we're effectively doing, the way that we measure inflation is we take a basket of goods and services, which we hold fixed. And so we say, everyone in the country buys this basket of goods and services, and it's got some electricity in it, it's got some bread in it, it's got some milk in it, right? And we look at that basket and we say, if the value of that basket goes up by, say, 10%, that's 10% inflation, right? We've held the basket fixed. We haven't changed what people buy. And if the value of that basket goes up, that's inflation, right? Because on average, prices for that basket must have risen, okay? Some things more than others, but the value of the whole basket's gone up. But of course, not everybody buys exactly that basket, and some things in the basket are more important than others. Superannuitants, for example, won't necessarily buy a new car to the same frequency that you might, right? Or that someone else might. Some consumers are able to protect themselves from inflation more than others, particularly higher income consumers who might have more ability to shop around, find other ways to buy things. Maybe some of the things that low income consumers buy are going up by more than others. So you're right. If the price rises are really severe in, say, basics of life, such as bread, electricity, petrol, those sorts of things, that's really going to hurt people who spend a bigger fraction of their income on those things compared to, say, higher income people who might spend their money on other things, better wines or steak or whatever. So inflation will hit different people differently and different groups differently.
Straight from your article, I want to read this bit out and then ask you about it. If one country's inflation rate is higher than its trading partners, then its currency falls in value. In the early 1970s, the New Zealand dollar was worth almost $1.50 US. Didn't know that. Our higher inflation rates of the 70s and 80s saw it fall to around 50 cents to the US, or half of the US dollar by the mid 80s. Does that mean at the moment here in New Zealand, we're doing quite well internationally? Because I look at the charts and I see us at 7.3, and I think like the UK is 9.1, US is 9.1. I mean, I don't know what China would be under their system. Is probably very low because they organize it in a different way under their communist state. But are we doing fairly well internationally, and how is our current inflation impacting New Zealand internationally?
So most developed economies around the world are experiencing the same set of factors. So I think there's three key things that are driving inflation around the world. There's obviously the supply chain disruptions. Inflation fundamentally is too much money chasing too few goods, right? So when you've got people who want to buy things, think of the economy like a giant auction, right? If you've got 100 people wanting to buy a laptop computer and there's only 30 of them, that's going to push up the price of those laptop computers. So it's too much money chasing too few goods. COVID and the Ukraine war in Ukraine has introduced a supply chain disruption, which has reduced the quantity of goods available for people. So you can see worldwide the limited scarce resources are getting bid up. And then you've got government spending, which because of COVID, governments have really gone hard on providing support for their economies, either through job support schemes, direct payments. So in America, they actually sent checks to people, right? So they've gone hard on supporting demand for goods and services. But the last thing that's happened that's different here is that central banks around the world have not quite got this right. And what they did was they bought a lot of government debt. When governments spend money in the quantity that they have to get that from somewhere. And what they normally do is issue debt or government bonds. And normally what that does is drive up interest rates, because the government now needs to borrow money from people like you and me, or our superannuation funds.
Right.
How do they do that? Well, they have to offer a better return. And the problem is that everybody else who's looking to borrow money then has to also match that. So central banks decided they didn't want interest rates to rise like that, so they bought the government debt. But what that did was it pumped money into the economy. So now you've got a lot of money sloshing around, chasing fewer goods, and surprise, surprise, what we get is inflation. To be fair to central banks, it was very hard to sit here 2 years ago and anticipate what might happen.
Yeah.
But I think they probably did underestimate the effect of their actions.
I saw an economist on News Hub a couple of months ago when this inflation talk started to ramp up, basically say one of the major drivers that the Reserve Bank got wrong was unemployment numbers. They were projecting unemployment would be a lot higher, and they set the rates based on that. And then because employment's a lot lower, that's one of the issues with inflation. And so what they're doing now, we're not going to see an impact for maybe 9 months. It's like a 9-month tail on it. Is that as you understand it?
Yeah. So the Reserve Bank cannot fix today's inflation, right?
Yeah.
So today, for the Reserve Bank, today is history. In fact, next week is history. And so they are looking out, and the decisions they make today will not show through for several months. So we've got inflation for a wee while yet. To be fair to the central banks around the world, others also made the same assessment. So, for example, car makers decided that we were headed for a recession. Reasonable to assume. Lots of people thought that was the case. And they cancelled. They scaled back their production because they thought, well, no one's going to be buying cars. And they cancelled a lot of chip orders. And then they realized that what was actually happening was because people couldn't go overseas on holidays, they were upgrading their cars.
Buying cars.
Yeah. And so what have we seen in the last year or two? We've actually seen the price of cars rise. Right. And I know people who bought a car a couple of years ago, just prior to COVID, and sold that car for more 18 months later.
Wow.
Particularly things like utes and things. And the car makers went back to the chip manufacturers and said, hey, we had misjudged this. Can we have our chips, please? And the chip manufacturers said, wait in line.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You talk about in your article as well the centralised bank, Reserve Bank here in New Zealand. And you say New Zealand Central Bank is the only one that can control monetary conditions. It's the only one that can get inflation under control. The same could be said for many countries facing growing inflation. If central banks don't take decisive action, we could get a sharp reminder of just how bad inflation could be. Now, the economist, and forgive me, I forget his name, who was talking about this on News Hub a couple of months ago. It was because it was the time where political parties were starting to talk about inflation, and of course the government is talking about what's going on, and the opposition parties are talking about how the government's terrible because that's their job as an opposition party. And this economist said at that point, actually, there is an impact by things like government spending, etc., but it's actually quite a small impact. Like the major things are these international things that the government has no control over, and the Reserve Bank are the ones that can fix it. I guess what would be cool, just in the last maybe 5 minutes or so, to talk about is what are the solutions, where to from here, how much of this does lie at the feet of Labour, the Labour government, how much it lies at the feet of the Reserve Bank stuffing up, and then, what do we need to do from here, in your opinion? And then if you've still got time, I'd like to have a look at what ACT is saying, because they've just put out a release saying they're going to fix all the ills around it. So the first thing is, how much of the responsibility of this inflation lies with the Labour government versus how much lies with the Reserve Bank?
Yeah. So look, I think Grant Robertson's trying to say that that they're not having any impact on inflation at all. It's all about the international events, and the opposition is trying to say that government spending is the cause of inflation. I think both are right and both are wrong. I don't think you can say that there's no impact on inflation from government spending, but it is not the big impact that the opposition is trying to say. All of those things are in the mix. But the effect of government spending has been magnified by central banks being willing to essentially print money to fund that government spending. That's a little bit of a simplistic way to put it, but you can think of it like that. And I think that's where the Reserve Bank has been a little bit of a misjudgment. Other central banks around the world also misjudged, so we shouldn't be too harsh. And we've got the benefit of hindsight. But they're now having to try and wind that back. So they're raising interest rates. They're trying to sell off the government debt and suck in that money that they have been pumping into the economy, and they need to do it. Because the problem for the Reserve Bank is not today's inflation rate. The problem for the Reserve Bank is if inflation expectations get out of hand. So if people start to expect inflation, and they say, well, next year inflation is going to be 8%, I'm going to ask for a pay increase this year of 8% because I need to protect myself from it. Well, once you start that, you have an inflationary spiral, and you will find it really hard. It's like toothpaste. You can get it out of the tube easily, but you can't get it back. And that's inflation. You don't get it back into the tube easily. And that was the problem we had at the end of the 80s, was trying to convince people that we were going to get inflation under control. Stop asking for 15% pay increases, right? And that's what the Reserve Bank will be worried about.
As an academic in economics, I'd like to, I had Michael Woodhouse, National Party MP, on the other day, and I asked him this question because we were talking about inflation when it went to 7.3. I had him on that day. And I said, if you were in government right now, right, what would be an acceptable level of inflation? Like, what level would it have to be today for you to actually applaud this government rather than, saying they're the ills of the world? And he said maybe a couple of degrees difference. So in other words, if it was 5.3 rather than 7.3, what he was saying on the day is that would be a pretty good result. I look at the rest of the world, as I said before, UK, America on 9.1, and I think we're kind of mid-table. Do you think the current climate, although no one would say it's desirable, New Zealand's in a good position, a bad position, an average position, sort of based on what's happening around the world?
Well, I mean, I think there's a risk that you declare yourself good, by comparing yourself to everybody else and saying, well, we're the least bad. It's a little bit like, standing in a room of very sick people and saying, well, because I'm the least sick, I'm healthy.
Yeah.
It's
the skinniest kid at fat camp analogy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And but I do think we have some advantages. We started with relatively low government debt, and that's a testament to successive New Zealand governments. We've been very fortunate in New Zealand to have a string of very able finance ministers, regardless of the type of government, and they have had a focus for making sure debt is relatively low, which has given us some headroom to be able to weather a little bit of a shock. Other countries haven't had that. And I think that we should remember that lesson when we're through this, that we want to then get that government debt down again.
Right.
Because it gives us the ability to have a little bit of breathing space. We have low unemployment. I think that is helpful for us, because if you start with 9% unemployment and you're going to get worse, then that's a very bad world. So that's an advantage for us. There are other settings in our economy which I don't think we've necessarily got right. But the big one for the Reserve Bank is they do have to move on this. They can't let inflation expectations get out. That's their problem. A little bit of a temporary period of higher inflation that's going to be damaging. But if it turns into a more permanent period based on on people's expectations of inflation, that's what they'll be worried about.
All right, finally, actually not finally, I've got two things to ask you about. This is the actual important one. The other one is very flippant and quite silly. But finally, in a serious manner, ACT has come out today with a proposal to lower cost of living, abolish trade tariffs, simplify immigration settings. They have done 9 points, the 9 proposals. They're going to solve the country, my paraphrase, but solve the country's financial issues. I'm going to zip through this as quick as I can. Then I'd just like your response to the whole lot of it. What you think, because this is as a voter, as a consumer, as a member of the public. What I want to get is understand when the people behind the pulpits say various things and they say opposite things. I kind of go, oh crap, which one sounds more plausible? That's why I love getting guys like you on to be able to say, can you disseminate this either BS or not BS for me and tell me what's going to work and not, and that helps me and my audience be informed. So their 9 proposals are: abolish all tariffs to reduce the cost of clothing, food and equipment imported into New Zealand; simplify the accredited employment work visa scheme by abolishing labour market tests, industry wage requirements and transfer restrictions; allow foreign supermarket chains from OECD countries to bypass the Overseas Investment Act to enter our sector; create a register of substitute materials to GIB and require councils to accept the materials. Gosh, I mean, like, I don't know much about all of this, but I read that and I think, geez, that sounds like a recipe for having some poor quality put into your housing. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. Incentivize and resource councils to provide infrastructure for new homes by sharing half of the GST levied on new housing construction in their regions with them. Simplify the tax system with a 2-rate structure, 17.5% to 70,000, 28% after that with a low and middle income tax offset and a carbon tax refund. Replace the RMA, that'll do. Return the Reserve Bank to focusing solely on taming inflation, that'll do. And reserve government changes like the fair pay agreement, extra public holidays, and bring back 90-day trials.
Yeah.
Geez, I mean, those do really sound like ACT policies, don't they? But anyway, what they're saying, this is going to solve our country's financial issues. What say you, sir?
Well, I think there's a mix of policies there. Now, most of those are not actually aimed at bringing down the cost of living. They're not inflation policies, right? Some of those policies are good ideas, but not for the reasons of bringing down cost of living. So abolishing tariffs, for example, is a good idea because it makes basic materials, clothing, it makes clothing, food, and so on cheaper for low-income households, right? Yep. So that's a good idea regardless of what your inflation rate is. Tariffs just simply add taxes to things that mostly low-income households buy.
Right.
So that's a good idea regardless of whether, in my view, of what the cost of living is, right? A lot of these other things are also about that. So, for example, are not about cost of living. So if you look at, say, the immigration ones, that's a conversation we need to have around what should our immigration settings be.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's independent of the cost of living. The foreign supermarket ones, that is about introducing competition into our supermarket sector. We've got to get competition into our supermarket sector, and one of the ways we might do that is make it easier for people to set up here. That's a good conversation to have. We've got rigidities in our building sector. One of the problems is that when you submit your plans, you have to specify the materials that you're going to build with, and you can't deviate from that. And that's a problem. And it's resulted in some products like Jib. Jib is not a product. Jib is not like brick. Jib is a brand.
Yeah.
Jib is a brand. And so Jib has become dominant in the market, not through their fault, but just because of the way the rules are written. So again, those are good things for us to have a conversation about, but they're not about the cost of living. The tax structure, reasonable people are going to disagree about what the tax rate should be. Some people are going to think that we should increase taxes on higher income people. Some people will think that tax rates are already too high on certain groups of people. That's a conversation that we should have, but that policy, again, is not aimed at the cost of living. It's aimed at what should our tax system look like? Who should we be taxing and how much? So lots of ideas here, which I think we should be having good conversations about, and deciding what it is that we think we want. And I can tell you about the advantages and disadvantages, say, of a particular tax system, but what I can't tell you is what you think is fair.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what we decide when we decide who we vote for, isn't it?
Hey, look, thank you for joining us today. My very last question for you, as an economics lecturer, I'm sure you're, switched on and finances are your thing. I'm wondering, have you ever thought of becoming like a Simon Pegg impersonator? Because I have to say, the similarity is uncanny between you and Simon Pegg, an actor that I love, and I think there might be a side hustle for you there.
He's the British actor, isn't he?
Yeah, he's in Hot Stars and a whole lot of stuff with Nick Frost. He's also in Mission Impossibles and all that kind of stuff as well.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I remember.
You have a side hustle there, to be honest. I think you should go for it.
I think it's just his lack of hair and receding hairline that makes you think that. So, yeah.
Hey, look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Stephen. Thank you
You're
very
welcome
for joining us and explaining all of that and taking some precious time out of your day to let us know a bit more about inflation and where to from here. Stephen Hickson from the University of Canterbury, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
There you go. If you're just joining us now, you missed the start of the show where I had to mea culpa a little bit and tell everybody that I wasn't originally going to be here. I was going to play this as a pre-record, play it out as live, and I basically stuffed up the setup, so I had to come in here at 1 minute to 10 and set everything up. Now, because of that, I'm not particularly organized right now. I'll let you behind the curtain a little bit. As Chewy said the other day, the reason I'm not looking at the screen is the screen that you were just watching that video off is also the screen where I put things up on. And if I put things up on them, you'd see me doing it. So I can't put things up on it whilst it's playing something. So right now, as I speak to you, I'm dragging some things across that I talked about in the actual show, which I want to talk to you about now. So lots of people talking about that conversation. Thank you for participating in it. The thing I found interesting, I didn't quite get into it with Stephen there because basically we went too long and I don't want to hold him up any longer, is this thing here concerns me about ACT, right? Because it sounds like deregulation. It sounds like, abolishing labor market tests. That sounds like a metric for measuring, someone's, quality of work, perhaps. Abolishing industry wage requirements. That sounds like a recipe for paying people as little as possible. And abolishing transfer restrictions. I don't know too much about that. And as I said about the JIB thing in the interview, create a register of substitute materials to JIB and require councils to accept the materials. Sounds like a recipe for having to lower the standard of product use in our houses. Hey, I wanted to show you this tweet that came in. This was some of the mask stuff I've been talking about. This just randomly came across my Twitter feed today. It's a teacher, obviously, hasn't identified what school they're at, but they've put this message up. Obviously, this is the message they've got from their school, that it appears that some schools are now going back to mandating masks, even though the government's too cowardly to do it. For the first 2 weeks of term 3, says this person's message, we will finish school at 2 p.m. Now, I read through some of the thread. The reason they're finishing them at 2 p.m. is they need to give teachers more admin time to cover for all the teachers who are away sick with COVID. So because so many teachers are away sick with COVID, they need to actually give the teachers more time to do stuff. Either that means they don't have enough teachers to go around, so they can't work as many hours, or they need more time, because they talked about admin, time to cover off, fix up, check in with students because they were doing extra work on other classes because of COVID as well. So for the first 2 weeks of term 3, whatever school this is, finishes at 2 p.m. And also they are saying for the first 5 weeks of term 3, staff, students and visitors to the school were required to wear a mask indoors. We will review this at the end of week 5. Please, if your child is not well, don't send them to school. Thanks for your patience and your understanding, etc., etc., etc. Now, whatever school this is, I applaud the school. Well done. Good on you. That's what the government should have the courage to use the M word. So the M word to the government right now is a dirty word, because if they use the M word, they're going to get a hit in the polls. So they're currently picking popularity over public health, and I think it's repugnant. Did some research on this idea of wearing masks at schools, and this article popped up straight away, and I thought, apart from anything else, it's a fascinating piece of, would you call this anecdotal research? Probably research, because it'll be official documents from the school. Schools with mask mandates saw fewer student absences than average in term 2. So set aside the COVID thing altogether, but with the COVID around at the moment, with the COVID, and with opening, getting ready for the next one, and with the idea of a pretty serious flu season around at the moment, just wearing masks inside in school seems to be keeping kids healthier, full stop, and enabling them to be at school for longer to actually get educated. So I can't see any downsides other than the government and perhaps some schools see it as a bit of a political football, and they're going to get slammed for it. Look, a huge number of messages have been coming in, and look, it's exciting to watch you guys talk to each other, which is what's going on in the chat at the moment. So I'm not going to go through and put them all out because you're talking to each other, which is great. There's one here that seems to be more of a standalone from Kim. I think there are plenty of opportunistic companies maximizing profits whilst also taking goat money. Carl says the ACT Party 9-point plan would affect those at the bottom as usual. The most surprising thing is how mask off they are. No fucks given, said Carl. I appreciate you put the F with all the things there, but you can put fucks if you want. I don't mind, Carl. I'll read it. Ayrton says, is that how you pronounce Ayrton? Is it Ayrton? Like pronounced E-A-R-T-O-N? Ayrton? Ayrton? I think it is. I used to go to school with a foot. Tim Foote, Sacred Heart College. I wonder if there's any relation. Probably lots of feet out there. Is that why? Is that why, when you get like a whole when your whole family gets together, Ayrton? So there's a whole lot of you. Are you a group of feet, or are you a group of foots? Because that just doesn't sound right. I'm just wondering out loud. There's no offense. There's always seems to be a focus on the inflation/wage spiral when it comes to low income earners. But what about the wage increase of the high income earners and record court profits? For your message there again. More. Wage earners causing inflation seems stupid to me. More money at the low end would lift the whole economy. Raise wages on the low end, I reckon. Yeah. And you're going for it. You guys are going. Yeah. Is that one there again? To be fair, more progressive countries have similar deregulation, i.e. Norway, but they have massive unions that regulate for similar worker protections. Not sure ACT's a fan of unions, though. Okay, so really, I'm quite excited about this chat. I've already been there. I've had this chat, so I know what it's about. But Academic out of Auckland wrote a piece about female representation in superhero movies. And we show the article in the story that's coming up next, but also we go as always with this ridiculous show. We go all over the place, right? We go all over the place when we talk about minority representation. We talk about what if it's a historical based movie? Like one of the points I'm about to make, in case you're shooting off, is like a historical based movie based on Vikings. You wouldn't need or expect to see minority representation in there because the Vikings were basically all, blonde hair, blue eyed. So if that was all it was, is that okay in this day and age? So I really enjoyed the conversation. I really wanted to get it to you now. So I'm still here. If you've got comments, get them in there. Let me also just say two things. I haven't said this yet. Tomorrow night, we are doing a Three Waters conversation. We have got Jordan Williams from the Taxpayers Union say, yes, he's coming on. I'm speaking to two other people, including Minister Nairn Mahuta's office. Not suggesting that the minister will be on, but maybe they can direct us to someone to talk to us about why Three Waters is a good thing, because I think the Taxpayers Union have made their line in the sand that they think it's a bad thing. Also, possibly one or two of the mayors who are on board with the Taxpayers Union might be coming up tomorrow. Now, I don't know whether it will be the whole show like sometimes we do on Friday nights, but we will certainly be doing a Three Waters special tomorrow night. Make sure you tell people, get people on board if they want to see it. Also, finally, as you see along the bottom here, the daily audio podcast. Tonight's daily audio podcast will not be the same as what you're listening to right now, because as I said, I actually pre-recorded this show and I uploaded it wrong, which is why I'm here live now. But the pre-recorded show that I uploaded, that's the audio that I put on the audio podcast. So the main two interviews are still there, a small conversation around COVID, all the subject matters there, but it'll sound a little bit different. Maybe you should all go sign up to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and listen to tonight's audio podcast and see how different it really is from the actual show. Anywho, female representation in superheroes. It's the big driving issues that we like to get into here in Big Hairy News. And here's my conversation around that. I'll still be here to put on your comments, and I'll be back after this conversation to wrap up. And if there's any comments to mention there, I will as well. Enjoy. Let us welcome to the show Dr. Angelique Nairn, a senior lecturer in the School of Communication Studies at the Auckland University of Technology. Angelique, good evening to you and welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to have you here. I'm a little bit nervous because you are a lecturer in communications and we're communicating, so you might have to give me a grade afterwards, or maybe you could use this as an example of how not to do it to your students. That'd be perfect.
I could do that, but I'm sure it's going to go fantastically, so you have nothing to worry about.
Look, thank you for giving us a wee bit of time today. We do cover off all sorts of things in the show, but one of the things we do like to talk about is kind of interesting topics in pop culture. Me and one of my co-hosts, Chewy, we're forever debating Star Wars and that kind of thing. And when I saw your story pop up, for the love of Thor, why is it so hard for Marvel to get its female superheroes right? I just thought, oh, that's right up our alley. Interesting conversation, and we get to talk about movies and shit as well. So perfect. So thanks for coming on and having a join with us. I mean, I've got a bunch of questions, and I've gone through and I've read some parts and highlighted some parts of the story.
Sure.
But maybe I just throw it to you to start with, And give us a bit of a synopsis or whatever as to this article that you've written, why, and maybe a brief synopsis of what it says as well. What's it all about?
Sure. So for the last couple of years, I've been doing research in and around gender representation. And one of the things that I became quite interested in was how women in film were being represented in superhero narratives. So while I'm not a big comic book fan, I can see the relationship between the two entities. What I saw was that when it was being adapted to the big screen, there was still some of the very strong I guess, hypersexualized content, a lot of the usual stereotypes associated with women being auxiliary to their male counterparts,
Yeah.
often being a damsel in distress, etc. And for me, I'm a big action film buff. I love watching action films. Marvel obviously is something that I really, really enjoy watching. And so, as a woman who really likes this stuff, it started to started to really bug me a little bit on a personal level
Okay.
that these women weren't necessarily getting really great storylines, or if they were getting really great storylines, they were often tampered by a male perspective, or in the case of something like Captain Marvel, they were getting a lot of backlash from diehard fans who just didn't like the perhaps feminist agenda that was coming through. So that led me to do some research. It led me to look at specific films. So I looked at the treatment of Black Widow across the Marvel movies up until her most recent film.
Right.
And I also looked at, with the co-author, the Thor reaction. So when Natalie Portman was announced as female Thor, as she was interpreted then, how people responded to that. And most people were not happy in the social media commentary that my colleague and I analyzed, and that was because they didn't see her as a superhero. So it was a culmination of all those sorts of things that led me to write this article for the conversation, which basically highlighted sort of the fact that the Marvel is massive. It's everywhere. It's constantly getting new audiences coming in, but as a woman and as a woman who has lots of female friends who also enjoy these films, it was starting to get to the point there. They've been going for so long. Why aren't there more kind of female-centric storylines? Why isn't it being catered more to what we might be more interested in seeing? Sure, we love the fight scenes and all of that just as much as anyone, but does it always have to be a love story? Does it always
Yeah.
have
Right.
to leave the woman sort of kind of waiting for her superhero to come and save her sort of thing? So that was where that article came from, basically.
Yeah. How you've just worded it there right now makes me think as well about the storylines, because I think about superheroes and I'm kind of thinking, post kind of Iron Man 1 2020, both for DC and Marvel, and Wonder Woman and the Scarlet Witch and Black Widow, and these people and all are all in there.
Mm,
But Wonder Woman had a love interest.
hmm.
Scarlet Witch had a love interest.
Yep.
I don't know if Black Widow did. I really like that movie,
She
but
was
I don't know
she
if he
was
did.
coupled. So they didn't actually play it as a love interest, but
With Hawkeye?
well, there was the illusion that she had more than a platonic relationship with Hawkeye, but we actually find that's not the case. But
Yeah.
she was also, I think she had to kiss Steve Rogers at one point. So while she wasn't necessarily a love interest, what I found with Black Widow when I looked at her representation was that she was the one female representative on the team, and
Yeah.
she was kind of, this is going to sound terrible, but the token female. The rest of the team were all dominant male personalities, and she was I'm the one who's more concerned about, the friendships and the relation. I mean, Civil War's a classic example. She doesn't take sides necessarily
Right.
because she doesn't want to be the bad guy. She's the negotiator. She's the feminist perspective there, and it's just as problematic in some ways as having them as the damsel in distress or the love interest.
So you're speaking to a certified moron, right? So just so you're clear on that for some of these questions, how
Sure.
do we know, and from you as an academic, how do you identify the difference between this character, whoever it is, being the person in the middle trying to keep the peace, and that this character is the female being the person in the middle trying to keep the peace? Like, I guess what I'm saying from an idiot's point of view is how how do we address that it's this character happens to be a female, or it's this character because she's a female?
I think it's because it highlights some of the stereotypical aspects associated with women in general. So they're where it highlights or it overemphasizes in some case the mothering influence that women are
Right.
supposed to have, and coupled with the fact that they're clearly aesthetically designed in their outfits, etc., to be the woman, often the hypersexualized woman. It kind of, regardless of whether or not they just want that character to be the negotiating character, it still emphasizes other elements, sorry, that ultimately put the female aspect at the kind of top of all the possible other identities that they could have. So it relies on a lot of stereotypes basically
Right.
to try and emphasize that actually she's not operating as just a uh, critical voice in situations. She's acting as this overly sympathetic, almost maternal character as the boys are fighting, as a classic example in Civil War.
The idea of being hypersexualized, I think you're obviously completely right. All you got to do is hear Scarlett Johansson talking about how they used to have to kind of peel the suit off her. But I'm also thinking, again, from a moron's point of view, what's the difference between that and say Liam Hemsworth, who obviously is a gorgeous man, physical man, and in the latest movie, which I haven't seen yet, apparently naked in that movie as well. Much mirth and joking made about that by Taika and himself about getting to see his bum during the movie. So again, from someone who doesn't get it, what's the difference between a hypersexualized female character being, I'll say bad, not your words, and a hypersexualized male character being like, woohoo, we saw his bum? Like, you'd never hear that if Scarlett Johansson was in the movie. It would be very uncommon to have a director say, and you guys should thank me for seeing her bum. That would be completely inappropriate. But saying it about Liam Hemsworth, sorry, it's
No,
kind of a laugh.
it's Chris. It's
Oh,
Chris
sorry,
Hemsworth.
Chris
Yeah,
Hemsworth.
they're easily. At one point,
Yeah.
Liam was supposed to play Thor, so I can see
Sorry.
how that. No,
You know
it's
what I mean?
interesting that
One's inappropriate and one's a bit of a laugh.
it's interesting that you should say that, because I would argue that they're both inappropriate.
Okay.
Because I mean, while I am disappointed in the representation of women in particular, we are starting to see that that same level of objectification is not exclusionary, in the sense that women have kind of become known to be hypersexualized, but we're starting to see that men are as well. So yeah, getting Chris Hemsworth's kid off in those films is kind of akin to the same thing. I would contend that unless it's actually doing something for the storyline, why does it need to be like that? And I
Yeah.
have seen that film, and while I can certainly appreciate the work that Chris Hemsworth put into looking the way that he did, I'm not going to say that I didn't appreciate it, because
Yeah.
that would be totally inauthentic. What I would say is that I don't necessarily think that it added anything to the storyline. So so what I'm contending is that it's all well and good to have these hypersexualized characters, provided they serve a purpose, and that it's not simply we want to attract, a young teenage audience who might quite enjoy watching people get their kid off. That sounds terrible, but you know what I mean.
Hey, what we do here is there's a little bit of stream of consciousness. I've got like a series of questions here which I haven't touched yet, and if I don't touch them, that's fine. That's kind of how we roll. Because as you're saying that, I've just had this thought pop into my head, and it's off topic for your article, but it's on topic for hypersexualizing male and female.
Mm.
And maybe you can explain this to me. And I think what you're probably going to say is neither example is okay. But I guess what I'm wondering is, why does society find one example okay and one not? I can remember as clear as anything an episode of Ellen, right? Primarily female audience, primarily female live audience as well, having kind of those kind of Australian strippers coming in who take the gear off and dance and do that kind of stuff, going through the audience, bumping and grinding, and the whole audience is like, whoop, whoop, like this. And I remember seeing that and just thinking, if that was a bunch of female strippers going through the audience doing exactly the same thing, the Twitterverse would explode with disgust. Now, as I said, I kind of imagine you're going to say both aren't okay, but in society, we seem to think huge amount of fun, it's okay. Male strippers, grinding, that kind of, no problems. Female strippers, oh no, we can't oppress, that's wrong, that's sexualizing. What do you have an opinion on that? Why is that?
I think that is because women have been oppressed for so
Right.
long and have had to respond to a patriarchal society for donkey's years, that basically, in order for us to be seen differently, we need to kind of break some of those representations. So that's why you'll probably find that there is a lot more backlash when you see women being like that, because it's kind of perpetuating what we're trying to break about how women should be represented within society. And on the flip side,
Mm.
I don't think it's great that Ellen was doing that. But at the same time, I can see why, in the sense that it's almost another form of subversion. It's another way of saying, well, for so long, men haven't had to do this, and I'm going to make a point of them doing it for the purpose of the show. Now, whether or not that underlying
Yeah.
motivation is there, I don't know, because I can't speak to that. But I think that it's almost trying to create the balance to make it sort of seem fairer. If we start exploiting men a bit more in this sexualized way, then does it mitigate the impacts that it's had on women? No, but it almost helps to perhaps justify it, which is in and of itself wrong as well, which is why I would say that both aren't great. But I think that it's because women have had to experience this for so long, and there's been major conscious efforts to try and change that narrative, that is why there would be a great deal more backlash now to
Yeah.
if that had been the role reversal.
What I hear you saying, and then we'll start talking about Thor,
Sure.
is that the pendulum has to maybe swing further one way before it finds its center. And maybe we're
That,
in that moment at the moment with men versus women. And also, I wonder, as you were talking about it, I wonder if a male stripper, dancer, exotic dancer, whatever the correct term is, still has quite a lot of power amongst a sea of women audience versus a female stripper amongst a sea of men. I wonder if that male stripper still isn't in the same sort of subservient role that the female would be amongst a group of men. I wonder.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point that you raise. I would tend to agree with that assessment, purely from an opinion, not because I've
Yeah.
done any research or anything like that. But yeah, I would, because again, it plays on that stereotype of the woman who's sort of fawning over the man, and that, I mean, still keeps the man still in a position of authority, even in a
Yeah.
situation where he might be being exploited for his physique. So yeah, it's one of those issues that you're right in the pendulum swinging. We need to try and find a middle ground, and we haven't. Well, at least in my estimation, based on all the research that I've done on the superheroes, we haven't quite got that with the superheroes, at least.
Fantastic way to bring it back to the actual conversation. I'm sorry about that divergent, but that's
No,
what we
it
got.
was great. I enjoyed that.
Okay, for the love of Thor, why is it so hard for Marvel to get its female superheroes right? Part of the article you're talking about Natalie Portman, and there was a lot of complaints about Natalie Portman because she wasn't swole enough, but she did a bunch of work and she actually became, fairly fairly muscular for her own
She
frame,
did.
compared to. And you say, yet that early reaction to Portman, meaning this is not going to work, casting attests to how representation of female superheroes can be difficult for movie makers when the established audience is often perceived to be young, white, cisgender, and male. It
Yeah.
seemingly doesn't matter that the number of women consuming superhero content has increased, offering feminist depictions of characters that could challenge the defining masculinity of the genre remains a problem. Couple of things I was thinking about that. The first thing is, do you know the numbers? Like, do you know the numbers of male to female? Because I think so often, and maybe a bit later in a few minutes, we'll talk about this. To me, I reckon for the studios, this comes down to money. Like how they make the most money. And if 99% of the audience is male, then of course they're going to make a product that's more dedicated to the male. If it's 50-50, then no. So do you actually know what the split is?
I don't know the split for films, but recent
Right.
statistics in comics suggest that it's a 49-51% split, with 49% being
Wow.
women.
Okay, so it's 50-50. So
Yeah,
that
there.
makes complete sense for like representation to be an even hand, because you're pitching to half the audience and half. Well, but that can actually, in saying that, there's another question. The female reaction, how is their reaction to the lead female, lead male? Because I know there's always a lot of people who, let's say, I guess what I'm asking is, do most females want to look to male characters as well? Or do they enjoy more and spend more to male characters? How does that work? Or is there 50-50 representation of the audience? Should that be reflected in the movie because that's how people see them? Like half of them want to see female leads, half of them want to see male leads. Do we know anything about that?
We know a little bit about that. So again, I'm talking about the comics before we get into the films. So
Yep.
in the comics, women are seeing there has been a big push in the industry to try and get more female-led, female-written, female-illustrated comics out there, which has perhaps attracted more women to that particular genre. So that's been really great because that has obviously meant that more women are consuming something and hopefully changing the culture around the consumption of comic books. In terms of films, I don't know what the read is on exactly the numbers, but when we were doing analysis of people's initial responses to Natalie Portman being appointed, a lot of women in the social media commentary that we were seeing were actually really happy about the fact that they were bringing Natalie Portman back because they didn't think that she got a great deal last time around, and
Right.
that it was the scope to get more women in these films and more lead roles, because one of the things that was observed was that more often than not, the women weren't getting lead positions. That's not to say that they don't enjoy the male dominated superhero films. That's not, but they want to see more options available to them as well. And if you think about it, they have been few and far between. I had someone, I noticed, comment on the article saying, well, there's lots of women in these superhero films, from Scarlet Witch to Black Widow to Gamora to whoever else. And I didn't comment, but one of the things that I thought was, but that's not representing women's voices, women's stories. Having someone there is not akin to, this is the experience for them. So bringing it all back to, I think it's a money thing. I
Yeah.
still think that you can make more money on these sorts of films from a masculine audience. I don't think women are opposed to them in the sense of they're not going to boycott them, but I do think that there is an undercurrent of, we're interested in more, and if you make more, we will come. And if they come from writing teams who are writing for a female audience, it can still be a great film for a man to come and see, just because it's a female lead. That's kind of the general commentary that was coming through from the selection that we explored, which is not extensive, obviously, it's not exhaustive, but
Yep.
it was enough for us to identify that there was a strong objection to Natalie Portman from diehard fans, often male fans, but there was an undercurrent of women who said, but look, we haven't actually seen her in the role yet. She might actually be a great addition. At the very least, if she's got a storyline that can work for us, that's cool too. As it happens, she doesn't have a storyline that works for them, but that's something else that we can discuss.
It's so funny. I mean, it's not funny, haha. It's like interesting because I look at a storyline for a storyline's sake. So, Wonder Woman's a really good example. That first Wonder Woman film, fucking amazing. Like such a good film. So enjoyed it as a piece of celluloid, although they don't make it on that stuff anymore. The second Wonder Woman film, hated it with passion because it was just a terrible film where it appeared to me that what they were trying to do over at DC is maybe copy what Taika did with the first Thor movie about having that kind of little kind of comedy in it. It just didn't work. And that actually for me wasn't about the lead character. It was actually about the storyline. And I wanted to ask you the same bit that I just said about, you finished that part of that I read out about defining masculinity of the genre remaining a problem. And obviously I don't probably quite get it all, but I'm thinking about characters, the defining masculinity of the genre. I think about the genre being made up of individual stories and individual heroes. And those heroes seem to be set up as they were in the comic book. So, for example, Hemsworth, whichever one it is, had to get massive for Thor, so he got massive for Thor. But what's his name? Ezra Miller, who plays Flash in the DC world, didn't, because he's a slight, small, fast character, so he didn't. Scarlett Johansson didn't to be Scarlet Witch, so she didn't. Jane Foster did have to get kind of swole, as you say, so she did. So when we talk about defining the masculinity of the whole genre, what do you exactly mean? Because I think about it like individual cases, but you seem to be describing it as the whole genre.
Because if you look at the whole genre, because the majority of the characters are male, because of even characters like Jane Foster having to emulate a masculine physique, there is still a dominant understanding of masculinity being there,
Okay.
and that kind of explains why so many people objected to the fact that she might be going in there just looking like a regular woman.
Right.
So the genre itself, because it still has quite strong links to masculine ideas of it, also fighting, competition. And I'm not saying that you can't have those in a superhero film. No, you should definitely have those, but there is kind of multifaceted aspects to see in relation to it. So storylines are about power and authority. The masculinity and the physique is definitely there. The lead characters are often male, or and the women are playing the subservient roles or the damsels or the bit parts. That kind of creates a genre that is predominantly masculine in its ideologies and its ideas. Whereas if you had more female characters, more female storylines, you'd be able to kind of create more of a balance there, as it were.
What do you think about general representation when it comes to the sexes as well? Like, I hear a conversation a lot about having representation, right?
Mm,
And it's kind of, I guess, kind of hard to talk about a superhero world in some levels because it's all make believe.
yes.
But sometimes the conversation seems to bleed into an area that there always has to be representation, no matter what the storyline. And
Hmm.
I'll give you a silly example. I
Sure.
wouldn't expect to see a minority face, whatever that is, ethnicity or whatever, if it was a story about Vikings. I would expect to see them all blonde haired, blue eyed, and Caucasian, because
Sure.
that's the storyline. Um, this is make believe fantasy, so of course anyone can be anything. That's the whole thing. In these storylines, though, they are emulating stories that have been around for 50, 60, 80, 100 years that was set then. So what's the importance of representation? And I guess this is a question as I find it towards the end. Don't beat me up too much, communications expert. What's the difference between sort of representation? How do we make sure we get representation when you have like a historical aspect? Is it important to make sure there's representation there versus, a fictional work that anyone can be anything?
I think that what's key is that all of this media content can be adapted. And even historical depictions. I mean, Hamilton, the musical, is a classic example of
Amazing.
where
Yeah.
amazing. I absolutely love that because it allows for different voices to be heard and place. And I mean, the cast is not all, cisgender white men, which is kind of what the historical depiction would have us, well, what it should be if we were to be accurate about it. Media allows us to challenge conventions. It allows us to look at things from different perspectives, to ensure that people are finding ways to identify things about themselves and about the society around them. So something like the superhero genre, where there isn't necessarily these strong conventions, there is
Yeah.
the scope to adapt it, to change it, to try new things to a greater or lesser extent, to evolve people's thinking about it. And you can do that with some of those, as Hamilton proves, historical retellings. It's because we have the value of it being film, we have the value of it being a television show, that we shouldn't be necessarily conforming exactly to what is expected, instead using it as a vehicle to try and think about things a little bit differently, to try and challenge some of the preconceived notions that may have subordinated people or may have mistreated people in society. And I think that superhero genre, with its popularity in particular, has this opportunity to really take a leading role and say, look, we're going to make a feminist perspective, a queer perspective, a just any perspective really come through, because we have the opportunity to do that. You're going to ostracize some audiences. I know that for a fact, but maybe the audiences that you ostracize going to be replaced by new audiences, people who didn't feel like they were adequately represented previously and suddenly have something that they can look at. I was reading an article before this interview, kind of in prep, let's put it that way, about a woman who was writing on the Shang-Chi film. And what she wrote was that what she really loved about that film was suddenly she was seeing someone who looked like her on
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah.
It's going to attract people if you challenge preconceived notions. And it's also going to create some controversy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing either. It gets people talking, and it gets people revisiting some of the ideas in society that maybe are a bit stagnant or a bit in need of evolution. So that would be my response to that.
Yeah, I wonder as well, and this is more just, I think, jumping out a step and looking into this conversation from the outside, is there seems to be like an ideal we're talking about in society of representation, but then we're also saying these movie companies should be doing that, which actually means what we're doing is we're putting the financial risk on them to do it, which may be successful, but as you say, maybe new audience also may not be successful. If they choose not to, I don't want to say this is a good or a bad thing, because they've got shareholders and they've got finances. If they choose not to take that risk, is that therefore something that the Twitterati should jump on top of and say that they're terrible because of it? Because they know, like any business, knows the audience it's got, and they want to pitch to that audience and make as much money as possible, as ugly as many people think that is. So we sit back and we go, well, this is what we want to see. If they sit there and go, we'll lose money doing that, and I'm using an exaggerator, we'll lose money, they probably wouldn't. But how do we then decide, well, you should take the risk because we want it, versus doing that another way, if there is another way?
Well, I think that they're already taking some risks anyway, because some of the stuff that they've brought out hasn't necessarily been resonant with their audience. So why not try something new, is what I would contend there. I understand, yes, they've got backers that they have to ensure get some sort of reward from being backers in the first place.
Yeah.
But at the same time, don't they also have to be conscious of the fact that you need to bring in new audiences? Not the same audiences aren't necessarily going to be the same audiences forever. And we have a new generation of people, and Generation Z, depending on how you want to say it, who are a lot more alert to these sorts of things. And if they're going to be your future audience for Marvel films in 10, 20 years, shouldn't we be looking to cater to what they're interested in as well? So that would be my argument. You can make incremental change, and I think that to a greater or lesser extent, Marvel does that, and then they take a step back, and that's what I feel like they did. Because Black Widow, the movie, when it finally came out, did start to challenge some of the preconceived notions about the character previously, and then that happens, and then we get Scarlet Witch coming through in the new multiverse film, and she falls back on all the traditional stereotypes associated with women. And then we get female Thor, or the mighty Thor as she's actually known, and suddenly we're back on those stereotypes again. So they do make these kind of incremental changes, and they get good responses, but they don't stick to them. So I think that if they're already doing it, keep doing it and look to evolve the audience with you. You can do it incrementally.
Here's my last question.
Sure.
And I'm really interested in this question, and you've prompted this question, right? Because at the start we talked about, Hemsworth's bum, and if it doesn't need to be a part of the story, why is it a part of the story? When we talk about representation and we talk about queer stories and we talk about that kind of stuff, and I'm not a writer, but how the hell do you have a queer story in a superhero situation that's not crowbarred in, i.e., that's not also just, quote, doesn't need to be there? I mean, how do you have a queer story, or pick whatever word you want to put there,
sure,
in a superhero story that's not just crowbarred in, and someone can't say exactly the same thing about that as they do about Chris Hemsworth's bum? And so how does that actually advance anything at all? Like if the storyline, the guy happens to kiss another guy and that's how they've done it, if it doesn't add to the storyline, though, isn't that just as harmful as what we're talking right now?
I would contend that you need to change your writer's room.
Right.
Because you can because what happens is, if you look, this is very stereotypical and I hate that I'm using it, but if you look at a traditional writer's room, they're generally the same sorts of voices over and over again. If you want to remove the tokenism that's starting to happen in some of the representations we're exposed to beyond simply superhero films, you need to have a more diverse writing room, and then you won't have necessarily some of the tokenism coming through. You'll have much more accurate, authentic representation. You'll hear their stories coming through. To give you an example, I'm interviewing for another project I'm doing on the creative industries, which is my other kind of big interest. And I was interviewing someone who's currently directing a play at the moment. And it's one of those plays that is about getting people to, it's got a transgender storyline. And the play is being developed, but because the director wants that level of authenticity and wants to make sure that she is representing the story right for transgender people, she's actually brought in consultants, people to, from the very beginning, coming through. What I'm suggesting and what I think should be happening is that, and you, part of the thing when you've got a big franchise like Marvel is that bits and pieces are being made here and there. There's no kind of necessarily, there's consistency, but there isn't necessarily flow in the way that there could be if there was more people being brought in of different diverse groups, and also kind of some people already established in there who could negotiate these storylines a bit more clearly.
It's really, it's really interesting. I mean, we could talk for another half an hour. We're not going to. I'm going to wrap up. But have you seen that clip from Carl Sagan in the 1980s talking about Star Wars?
No, I have to be honest. I do like Star Wars, but I'm not that invested. So no, I haven't seen it.
It's not about Star Wars necessarily. It's Carl Sagan talking about basically he does have his tongue in his cheek, but he is basically talking about how Star Wars is racist. Isn't it funny that we go to a galaxy far, far away and all the people are white? And all the people with privilege are white, and all the subservient peoples are things like Wookiees. And at the end of it, the Wookiee doesn't even get a medal, but the two men do, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you mentioned accurate and authentic stories around representation. And I think about Sean Penn and Milked. Amazing movie. And the perfect reason, I mean, the reason of his story is about, it's an LGBT story. But then we talk back to your article about superheroes. Superheroes are neither accurate nor are they authentic because it's make-believe.
Sure.
And that just makes me think, in those historical accurate representations like Milk, you're not crowbarring the story in. It is the story. But when you're dealing with something that's not authentic and it's not accurate, I guess my concern is a little bit like what you've said about if it doesn't need to be there for the story and what would it be there? It wouldn't offend me or put me off, but I'm like, if that's what we're saying, if that's a metrical standard we're setting today, I just hope that, as you say, the writer's room have a way to have all sorts of representation in there, but do it in a way that makes sense to the storyline as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the last thing I want is to encourage more tokenism because we need more representation. That's not it. What I'm saying is that you need to diversify, you need to give those people more options to be able to invest in lead storylines, to evolve characters, to introduce new characters in a way that it maintains some integrity to the original text and the original aims, but also looks to try and grapple with bigger issues. Because it goes back to that idea, yes, it's all fiction and it's fantasy and it's supposed to be fun, but if it's a platform to be able to escape to other worlds, why can't it also be a platform to challenge people's thinking? Because it is a large, vocal, obvious platform to be able to do that. And I think they've started doing it in bits and pieces and got a lot of backlash for it, but they need to continue doing it in order to be able to evolve society in some way.
Dr. Angelique Nairn, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me in the conversation today. Hopefully, when you critique me later on, you won't be too harsh on me.
No,
but
it's been wonderful.
No, that was amazing. Thank you for joining us, and we really appreciate you giving us some time. If people want to have a look for your article, let me just bring it up so they can get the heading themselves. And I know it's on the conversation, but I was reading the version of stuff for the Love of Thor, why it's so hard for Marvel to get its female superheroes right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty then, back again. I guess I learnt this with my conversations with Chewie around Star Wars. You bring up superhero movies, or you bring up special effects movies, you bring up that kind of movie, and people go banana. So the chats have been a bit crazy actually all around this. I want to acknowledge and share some of the things that have been going on in the chat. First of all, very good to hear that Eton has confirmed to us that if there are many foots in a room together, they are proud feet. So that's good to have. Right, onto the women in superhero movies. I'm not gonna. There's people here with multiple comments. I'm just gonna read the comments. You guys can see your names up and feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Just have more women characters, then they can be the negotiator and the hothead who refuses to negotiate. Seems pretty straightforward. Chris Hemsworth, Pat, says Tiger. Yeah, I saw it might have been a TikTok of Chris Hemsworth the other day. If you haven't seen it, if you've seen it, you know what I mean. Where he was walking away from the camera and it was the song "These Boots Are Made for Walking." He actually looked ridiculous. He was so broad across his shoulders. It actually looked like he had like a prosthetic body on. His body looked so out of shape. And personally, I find Liam Hemsworth to be far more attractive. It's just my own personal taste. But Hunger Games, Liam's Hemsworth, much more my cup of tea than Chris. Just saying. Each to their own. Aussie Bob, wow, these are fictional movies, which is quite what we were saying at the end. Target audience here, not me. Wow, representation of women through movies. Turn off your TV, love. Well, she's an academic writing an academic piece, but no, we kind of got to that. It's like, yeah, representation is, I don't have a problem with the concept, but the idea of, I use the term at the end, crowbarring it in, is that a bad thing? And when it's like, someone's also kind of made some criticisms a bit later on of this, and I'm happy to do that. When I started talking about the Vikings being, all white, because this is very much a stream of consciousness conversation, sometimes I'll hear back a question that I've asked and go, oh, yeah, I didn't really get my point across there. And I know that I often say when you have to explain the joke or explain what you meant, you've lost the narrative. And so I've lost the narrative on this. But what I was kind of saying is, would you be criticized for making a historically accurate film if it had no representation of minorities? That's what I was saying. Because sometimes it feels like there's criticism by some people towards people creating art for when they don't have various representation. I don't care what it is. It might be representation of men, women, a minority, an age demographic, whatever it is, when what their piece of artwork has done is still accurate to what they were trying to do, And so the interesting thing about Hamilton, which is I love it. It's probably been played 40 times in this house. My kids know it all word for word. It's unbelievable. He's one of my bucket lists. I have actually written to him and tried to get him onto a podcast. So, I absolutely love it. Would he have been criticized if they had have all been white males in that show? I mean, the reason it worked was because it was all minorities except for King George, obviously. But would he have been criticized if it was all white males being accurate? That I'm interested in that conversation as well. Doesn't mean that I'm thinking it should be all white males or whatever. I'm just thinking if it was, would that be something like he has an interesting story, has Lin-Manuel as well, because then he did In the Heights. And In the Heights featured a part of, I think it's called Washington Heights, isn't it? A part of, I think it's New York. Just double check those things. I don't know what In the Heights as well. And it featured a whole bunch of Latinos, but they weren't the same Latinos that actually live in the Heights. So he actually did get a lot of criticism for that. And he kind of mea culpa a little bit as well. Yeah, so I think this whole representation thing is fascinating. And you have to understand, for people who are just joining in and looking in one time, you might look at that dude trying to find a reason to not represent. It's not that at all. I genuinely think these are interesting conversations. And for those of you who watch me know that's how we roll here. So I don't care if other people don't think that. A Tiger says, I saw Black Widow as being strong enough to make her own decisions rather than just following the leader that the others seem to be doing. I loved Black Widow. That was so good. What else we got here? Cash grab. Marvel's a cash grab at everyone and anyone. It also controls a huge chunk of blockbuster film media. God forbid it's a little more diverse or nuanced. Oh, look, there's just so many. Carl talks about, I thought you were going to write Dora the Explorer for some reason. I wonder what she thought of Doya. I don't know who this is. Millier and the Wakanda Royal Guard. Were there any female characters that didn't conform to those stereotypes in Marvel movies? Yeah, look, this is the downside of doing a pre-record interview. I can't throw your questions at the people as well. Kim says recent Disney, actually says Easant, but I'll put an R in there. Recent Disney princesses, save themselves and the world less. So with like a Snow White who needed to rely on a man to save them. I think it means to save themselves, that need to be saved less, perhaps. And look, I agree. I mean, Moana was a classic example, of like sort of the first non-white princess that was out there, and that representation did amazing things because it's unbelievable. Hey, also just on the point of crowbarring and representation, I was thinking again as I was watching that back and listening to it. Of course, there's the Amazonians. I mean, that is a storyline of all women. So would that be classified as, they're all partners? Would that be classified as a queer story? And it's not crowbarred in because it's what that island is, which is when the male turns up. It's so strange. So yeah, I don't know. Look, I mean, I'm a I'm a certified Moor, and I'm just kind of sharing some thoughts and getting it out there. Hey, look, let me just tell you about a couple of things going on. I'm just moving some stuff across to talked about. One of them is very exciting. Actually, both of them are very exciting. You guys know that I do a podcast as well called The Department of Conversation. This is The Department of Conversation. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Professor Dave is going to be on. Professor Dave is a YouTuber from the US. He's got 2 million subscribers. And he is going to be on tomorrow morning, and we have a lovely conversation. He is a science communicator, and he is someone who... I found him with some of those flat earth conversations that some of you know that I love. So that's when I found him, but he's a really interesting science communicator, and he delves into all sorts of stuff, and he takes debunking quite seriously because he sees it as an important job to do. But he also is, a legit science communicator, and he wants to, as I say in this little thing here, Dave's goal is to increase science literacy in our society. So that will be playing out live tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And then, of course, available on demand in all the same places. And the cool thing that we do here, I'm just telling you about our cool things because we're so cool, that we do here is the YouTube channel that you see this on is the same place that the DOC goes on as well, because it's sort of, we treat that YouTube channel as sort of a station or a studio, DOC NZ Studios, and any content that I make goes onto there. So Professor Dave will be on the YouTube channel tomorrow morning from 9, and on the Facebook page that he's there as well. And look, I'll tell you, and you guys can tell the world about that. Also tell the world about the Three Waters conversation tomorrow night. That'd be great to have you guys on board for that. And your questions will be most welcome. Jordan Williams is going to be live with us. I don't know about any other views that we will have on for that night, but there's one person that will be with us live. So if you've got questions about Three Waters, it'll be great to have you tomorrow night. The other thing I wanted to share with you, right, is I couldn't start this before because you would have heard it. Now this one, don't tell anyone this. Right, this is a secret.
Okay.
Tired.
Okay.
I did evangelicals for Trump, then I did Indian Americans for Trump, then I did Asian Pacific.
The documentary filmmaker who's made Unprecedented, right, which is an exclusive look in the 2 or 3 months lead up to the American presidential election, and then also access to President Trump for 6 months afterwards, is on my podcast next week. I think, and I'll check this next week, I think this is a New Zealand exclusive. I don't think he's talking to anybody else. And if he has talked to somebody else, as you will appreciate, it'll be a 3 to 6 minute conversation, yet he's with me for an hour next week. Now, I'm talking to him in the DOC, Department of Conversation, not this, but I think what I'll probably do, because it's such a high profile news story, is probably next Friday night, even though it'll be DOC branded, unless I can figure out a way to brand BHN over the top of DOC. I'll have a think about that. Next Friday night, I'll probably play the podcast with Alex, who is the director of this, in its entirety on Friday night. Okay. It's a bit of a coup getting this guy. He spent weeks in the White House with Trump. He was on the stage on January 6th when all of that happened. He was on the stage with Trump filming, and he was called to testify before the January 6th committee, and his footage from the documentary that he's made was used as a part of the January 6th committee. It's honestly, I mean, it's a pretty massive get. As I said, I think it's a New Zealand exclusive. I could be wrong with it. You might see this weekend that there's interviews and papers and stuff because it's currently showing on 3 on demand, this series. But that is a conversation that's happening next week. Now, when I said that's a bit of a secret, I'm telling you, don't tell anyone else about that. Because if this is a New Zealand exclusive, I don't want to be gazumped by someone else getting an interview with him in the next 6 days. So anyway, tomorrow night, Three Waters. Tomorrow morning, Professor Dave on the DOC, and next week, Alex Holder, the documentary filmmaker of Unprecedented, spending 6 to 12 months with Donald Trump and his family, going through that whole cycle. I saw an interview with him yesterday, and he said he thinks one of the reasons they got access is they all thought they were going to win. So it's watching Trump lose the election and then the following sort of 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And as I say, if anyone else gets him, they will do him for 6 minutes, and I'll do him for a full hour like we always do. All right, guys, I'm quite glad I cocked up my recording tonight because I got a chance to hang out with you guys and it was fun. And there's still lots of people talking. The pad is on fire. That's like the same one that James Hake used last week. Oh, what this one means a basil brush boom boom pat. There you go. Very good. And a well done, Pat. Thank you very much. Coup says there. Yeah, what's a coup? I see what you did there. See what I did there? Coup, January 6th. It's a bit of a coup. Yeah, look, most of you picked up on that. Very good. Look at that. Nice interview. Good. And remember one other thing. Monday night, Monday is the 100th anniversary, our 100th episode. So Monday night will probably be quite chilled and relaxed. George will be here. Chewy will be here. There'll be some people dropping by once in a while to come and say good day. And we'll probably talk to you a little bit about what we've done, where we've been, where we're going. I mean, we're still very, 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 very small. We've had about 70,000 views, I think, in the first 100 episodes. So, little. But we're going somewhere. We're moving somewhere, and we want to share with you where we're at, where we're going, what our plans are. And as we always say in all of our tweets and stuff, and I was going to say, as you can see down the bottom, but I've got the wrong one. The way you help us right now is to share our shit. #ShareOurShit, or whether you come and see us on the Facebook page and share our shit, or whether you follow me on Twitter, which is down there at the bottom. I'll be doing those 2 interviews will be going out as clips tomorrow, and so you'll be able to share them if you follow me on Twitter and get it out there. Right, are we finished? I think we're finished. After all of that, this is so much longer than the actual pre-recorded conversation. Three Waters tomorrow night, Professor Dave tomorrow morning. Next week, we've got the documentary filmmaker from Unprecedented. Next Monday is the 100th episode. And other than that, we'll catch you tomorrow night from 10 p.m. for another edition.